I'm super pleased to introduce Rob. He's our CEO and one of the co-founders. He is an architect and a computational designer, and also our head of product as well as CEO. So he's got lots of hats. He has really led, I guess, the design and development of many of the of the features that we'll talk through today. So yeah, over to you, Rob.
Thank you. And welcome everyone. It's really exciting to be able to show something that we've spent the better part actually now of a decade building, and see how you guys are using it. So I wanted to just cover three ways which we think about Giraffe, which hopefully are very clear to you already intuitively, and then talk about why we're doing it, why we focus on those three things. The people in this call represent organizations that have hundreds of billions of dollars of assets on their balance sheets and are deploying billions of dollars building new cities every year. So that can be anything from transport infrastructure, schools, through to multifamily or commercial. And we think, and doing that well, doing that prudently and creatively is their job, is your job. But when we think about the impact that has beyond the finance or beyond the mandate that you have to deliver a financial return or a policy outcome, it's an incredibly serious job, because humanity is an urban species now, and people live in cities, and the decisions that are made by people on this call and their organizations profoundly impact the lives of millions, if not billions of people. And we take that extremely seriously. And so we think of Giraffe in three ways to try and improve decision-making in cities, which is our absolute mission. And the first way we think about Giraffe is it's just an individual force multiplier. So for a person who is thinking and probing a problem, trying to tease it apart, trying to understand it, trying to communicate some ideas or be creative, Giraffe is an outstanding tool. And that's where probably our most relentless focus is. And I think of that as power to weight. Giraffe is incredibly powerful, but it's probably not the most powerful tool in any of the categories in which we play, but its power to weight ratio is outstanding. So whether you're doing some GIS analysis, some design modeling, communication, you're able to get a handle on Giraffe very quickly and get an outcome that's necessary. And we focus on those two metrics because we want to get as many users as possible in Giraffe and add value from the intern all the way up to the C-suite, have the power to do that without demanding that someone needs to do a 3-year technical course to understand Giraffe. So optimizing that power to weight ratio and being extremely useful, even if you're the only person that who uses Giraffe is still creating value. The second way we think about it is as an enterprise tool. And that's because we understand that capital is being deployed at an enterprise level. Very few people in the world can build a tower with their own money. And even if they have, they're one of the lucky few that can build a tower with their own money, they still need to deal with enterprises, with banks, with engineers, with architects, with government, with large organizations. And there's no city moving infrastructure or city making that happens outside of an enterprise. And enterprise and individual, they're very different. If you can just get everyone facing the same way and thinking about the problem in the same way, you've basically won at an enterprise level. But that's incredibly difficult. And I know that the other people on this call have felt this problem of how do you standardize data across an enterprise? How do you make sure that people are on mission, that they have what they need, that they're not working at cross purposes, that things aren't falling through the cracks? And so Giraffe is built with that again, right at the center of the product, helping do that organizational plumbing, that administrative work, and lightening that load. And finally, we think of Giraffe as an ecosystem, and that's because cities are ecosystems. What's magic about cities is proximity to other people with other viewpoints, with other expertises. That diversity provides the creativity and energy of cities. And we want our product to work in the same way. So we know what we're good at, and we aim to be the best in the world at what we're good at, and we don't want to do anything that we're not good at. So we can talk with Footprint Company and Caro about carbon, because that's not our bag. And our product is built to allow experts to come together without, in a really nice way that mimics what actually happens now. No project is done without this already. You're collaborating in the real world, and Giraffe is allowing you to collaborate in the digital world. And to drive it home again, the reason we do this is because the decisions that are made by your organizations profoundly impact people's lives. I think of neighborhoods that have, say, led to an extra hour commute because things were unplanned or infrastructure was failed to deliver. That's an hour of time away from families. Like, there's a real direct link between the assets that we build and what kind of life is possible in and around those assets. So profoundly important. And part of that impact that we're worried about, or that we think about, is how we actually utilize this planet's resources. And so I'm pretty excited to intro Dr. Caroline Noller, to talk about decarbonization. She's recognized internationally for her contribution to the development of property carbon and energy life cycle analysis. She founded the Footprint Company, which has mapped millions of square meters and even more square feet of buildings, with a vision of delivering low carbon design leadership. She's also an incredible skier, and I think she's joining us from Japan, where she has been for the purpose of work or skiing. I'm not sure. So, Caro, how are you?
A bit of both, but I don't have a goggle tan at the moment because Japan doesn't have any sun at this time of the year.
Oh, well, that's a shame. Caro, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Let's dive straight into it. Why don't you remind us how big the impact of construction is on carbon emissions?
Yeah, I mean, it's that great question, Rob. When we look at the stats, you imagine the building stock that we have today on the planet and the forecasts by the UN for human urbanization, as you elegantly said it, is to look at a doubling of all those square meters by about 2060. So, 2x the number of square meters we've got. Obviously, a lot of that's going to happen in cities on existing buildings, but that's sort of the same as trying to build all of the building stock of Japan each year from now until 2060. And so, and then on the background of that, with the whole climate crisis concern, we are needing to at least sort of see from today a 50% cut in the embodied carbon intensity of all that new construction, if we're going to have this pathway that gets us down to those Paris targets. So, and each year that we delay that line just gets steeper. So if we sort of miss, by 2030, then the cut becomes 65%. So imagine we're doubling the building stock, but we have to do it at half the carbon footprint. So it's sort of like, if you think about, okay, from a planning perspective, planning authorities say, okay, well, you can build that new building stock, but it has to be at zero net additional carbon footprint. So that's the scale of the challenge, because we all know infrastructure capability and just knowledge at this point in human time doesn't give us the ability to act at that speed. So we're, everything in all power steaming forward to try and grow capacity in the sector to act.
And what are the policy moves? I think people would be familiar with things like the Paris Agreement and these high level global agreements, but what's happening at a more local level?
There's been a lot of action. I think it's been fantastic to see the amount of action, particularly in the last 2 years. But you've still got a bit of fragmentation for those of us who at that forefront of policy and regulation and just industry movement. We're all talking at the moment that it took us as an industry sort of 15 years to get on top of operating carbon intensity, energy use intensity planning. So mostly around the world, most developed countries are now used to things like energy use intensity for operating carbon. You want to build an office building in Philadelphia, then the US Section 24 guidelines, Title 24 guidelines say you can't have an energy use intensity of that office space of more than however many kilowatt hours per square metre. 15 years that took us to have the world come up with consistency. And we're talking about basically trying to do the same from an embodied carbon perspective in 5. So there's this enormous action starting to happen. But I think the main thing that everybody's sort of starting to realise is, okay, now we need a little bit of consistency, and how are we going to get capacity growing at the speed of trying to sort of augment and implement all of that level of policy. So we look at the EU, for example. EU has had mandatory measure and disclose to get planning approvals for at least the last 3 years. Each country's sort of slightly different timing. The UK has got to a point where they're very keen this year, 2023, to get a thing called Part Z out, which is like, in Australian terms, Section J, but it's for embodied carbon. The Australian Building Codes Board is looking at, well, what's the next version of the building code in Australia? The Neighbours team are hot on the track at the moment of trying to deliver a prototype embodied carbon evaluation assessment this year as a trial. And then over the background of that, finally, all the QSs of the world have got together and sort of said, okay, well, from an international quantity surveying perspective, we want to get embodied carbon measurement parallel to financial evaluation of buildings. So there's been fantastic work with the harmonisation of a reporting and measuring standard that has been launched this year, which is great, because that also then ties into the International Standards Accounting Board, which is now trying to accelerate for public companies. You must now disclose your carbon liability in assets existing and future assets. So for development companies, I've got a 5-year development pipeline of 25 million square metres of buildings. I need to start thinking about disclosing, well, what's my risk and opportunity financially for the carbon footprint, the embodied carbon footprint of that development pipeline, and disclose that publicly. So a lot happening. So, and everybody needs to really be starting to think about exactly what they need to start doing now.
And yeah, so it sounds like I've picked up 2 things. It sounds like the wheels are turning in various ways, in lead, neighbours, SEC, government, at different speeds around the world. There's a capability gap. What do you think, would the organizations like REITs, developers, how should they respond to these coming legislative changes, as well as the need to decarbonize?
Yeah, put your feet in and start growing your capacity. I mean, obviously our work with you guys is very much focused on how do we reduce the complexity and that time barrier and that knowledge barrier to taking action, to start quantifying, start assessing, and start just basically understanding how big is it, where is it, what can we do about it. And so I don't see there's any excuse. I shouldn't sort of say that in a negative sense, but it's really imperative. I mean, if you want to sort of not get hit by a big brick, you want to be acting this year, 2023, to start getting on board with actually understanding the implications, particularly for developers and for planning authorities. I mean, there's a lot of action happening in Australia at that planning level and state government levels, national as well, about sort of, okay, we have to start understanding how big is this and get some consistency and then integrate it into policy. So I feel like that is going to put a lot of impetus behind action in this year. And as I said, we've got lots of different examples that show certain methods that you can follow. And it's I guess I also quickly want to make the point, it's not just about low carbon steel, low carbon concrete, because the concrete, steel and aluminium and glass and all those industries, they have roadmaps to net zero that go out 2050, right? So they're sort of not moving particularly fast. So we can't wait for them to move. The opportunity here is really for planning authorities, banks, financiers, and the leading developers to go, you know what, we're going to take that action, we're going to understand, we're going to start to create push measures, policy incentives, planning incentives, and actually move the the pathway forward, because it's not just the materials, it's about how the design comes together. What are the different design strategies? The picture you've got there is the AMP Capitol Tower that was just recently finished in Sydney. That was an adaptive reuse. It's been framed in the media as like the world's first reused skyscraper. And the approach there was to essentially reuse the entire structure of that building, saved time, saved cost, and obviously an enormous amount of embodied carbon. There's sort of they're suggesting that sort of something in the order of 9,000 tonnes of CO2 avoided. So if you think about it from a planning point of view, you've got AMP owned that existing site. In the future, they may have had a cap that means if they wanted to renovate or deconstruct that building and reconstruct it, that cap might sort of say, okay, well, you can do that, but you can only build 20 stories, not 48. The other project that we had sort of talked about, which is 20 at Martin Place, they did an adaptive reuse because they had an existing building height that no longer existed. And so for them, the only way they were able to repurpose that building was to retain the structure. And it's an important point because just by retaining structure, you're able to avoid a significant component of all that carbon, 15% in many cases in CBD buildings. So coming back to that sort of, well, what does that mean for everybody? There's multiple different ways that you can save carbon. Most of the 50% of the carbon's in that first few stages of design. So having a planning tool that allows you very quickly to iterate and to quantify is critical. And it's, I guess our mission is really about opening the box of Giraffe and enabling so many different actors at that early stage to start at least quantifying and understanding so that they can appreciate, well, what can be done. And for planning authorities, okay, what's the carbon implications of our LEP? What's the carbon implications of our urban growth strategy, and understand whether they're going in the right direction, which likely they're not, and what are the pathways that they should be looking at in terms of carbon caps to move forward to actually sort of start to be the drivers of that agenda down to that Paris target.
Yes. Thank you, Kara. And I think that's an awesome way to close. So if it can't be measured, it can't be managed, and having access to carbon data so that you can, whatever the strategy is, at least figure out the magnitudes of what you're dealing with, whether is the mission that you've been working on and part of the reason, that we've partnered with you to have this carbon and data, because it's very difficult. There's not the capability in the industry to understand it. And so bringing it to the forefront when it's this huge component of carbon emissions is something that we really believe in. So thank you, Kara.
That's a pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And I think you guys are awesome and terrific to be part of the vision. Lovely. Thank you.
Yes.